I'm Mikki Dunoiho, I'm on the Election Integrity Commission. You have two recommendations from the Election Integrity Commission. One to require the addition of precinct scanners to the election system acquisition, and one to authorize an experimental precinct-based hand count audit of a couple of early ballot precincts. You also have two memos condemning these recommendations, one from County Administrator Huckleberry and one from EIC Member White. These two condemnatory memos contain such flagrantly untrue statements that I must respond in defense of your Election Integrity Commission's carefully considered recommendations. Mr. Huckleberry's memo claims that you need to reject our recommendation in order to maintain voter confidence in election systems. This reminds me of the slogans in George Orwell's 1984 that war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Your EIC made recommendations to you to try to move Pima County in the direction of restoring voter confidence, which has been lost through Mr. Huckleberry's closed ballot counting system with no statistically useful hand count audit of early ballots. Mr. Huckleberry has been fighting election reform for the entire 10 years that I have been involved in the election reform movement. His election director, Brad Nelson, lobbied in 2006 to water down the hand count audit law so that only 1% of early ballots are required to be counted. There is no requirement to compare early ballot hand counts with officially reported election results, and there is no requirement to audit county elections at all. Pima County has fought election reform in the courts using millions of taxpayer dollars to prevent expansion of election transparency. Mr. Huckleberry and Mr. White describe an audit process in detail that is not prescribed in our recommendation and need not be employed in an actual experiment. They have tried to make the experiment sound unworkable by prescribing unneeded steps as if they were required. Both Mr. Huckleberry and Mr. White warn of dire problems in the event of a challenge to the results of the official ballot count. If such a challenge were launched, its resolution almost certainly would not rely on the order of ballots in the boxes as scanned, but would require a new count, probably by hand, of all ballots. Contrary to Mr. Huckleberry's and Mr. White's assertions, Arizona law does not prescribe any retention of the order of ballots after scanning. It does not limit your authority in any way to perform an experimental hand count audit of early ballots. You have repeatedly chosen to follow Mr. Huckleberry's advice instead of the advice of the Election Integrity Commission. If you insist on lack of transparency, there is no need for an Election Integrity Commission. If you choose rather to respect and act on the recommendations of the Election Integrity Commission, you have full legal authority to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Dunoiho.
Madam Chair,
Supervisor.
I feel just a question for Mr. Dunoiho. Thank you for being here today. I do appreciate the work you all do. When it comes to this request that you made in the response from Jim Drake, forget about our county administrator, our county attorney, who you say we shouldn't be listening to. This man, Mr. Jim Drake, you're familiar with him. He's the elections expert in Mr. Bennett's office. He believes that to introduce the proposal at this late date in the election process is problematic. If you get a lead and you get ahead of next year, that's not a statewide ballot. It's an off year. Would you think that starting earlier and making a request from the next Secretary of State, or if Mr. Drake is still employed by that person, which is likely?
I don't know who the next Secretary of State will be.
Well,
I can tell you that Mr. Bennett, when he first became Secretary of State, he came to our Election Integrity Commission meeting and told us explicitly that he thought graphical scanning of ballots for audit purposes was a great idea that he would support, and asked us to send him a proposal. We sent him a proposal. He then said, oh, well, I think I need to have special legislation to authorize this. He didn't need special legislation. The legislation on the books already authorized him to experiment with new technology. We got him the special legislation. He then said, oh, I think I need to wait until after the 2012 election before we do this experiment.
You're not pertinent to his question.
Am I not answering your question?
I'm okay so far.
I'm telling
I
you,
appreciate
I'm telling you that Mr. Drake cannot be trusted, because after the 2012 election, when we tried to do the graphical scanning experiment that had been specifically authorized by law, he decided that the Secretary of State was no longer interested in doing graphical scanning. So we went through a 3-year process of trying to get the Secretary of State to do something about auditing early ballots, and it came to naught. And I think that we could work for the next year or 2 or 3 and try to get the Secretary of State to change his manual, and I expect it would come to naught, because I don't think the Secretary of State is interested in this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Listen, I understand your frustration. It's reflected by your tone. And I'm sorry that you've been stymied, as you say, at the state level.
Just incidentally, the Secretary of State testified under oath that the Secretary of State's office has no authority to tell Pima County what to do.